Okay, good morning. The topic today is milk kosher? So generally we assume that anything that comes from a kosher animal by definition is kosher itself. This is a Mishnah, and it's also a Siman in Yoredei, a Pei Aleph. This you don't have in your Marmakomos, but I'll just read it to you. The Mechaber tells us, Cholav behema v'chaya tameya o treifa. If you have milk coming from a behema or a chaya that is tame or treif, so then that milk is going to be asurim kibisara, has the same status as the flesh, of the animal. And the opposite's also true, that if a cholav comes from behema tahora, an animal that is a species that's kosher, and it's not a treifa, so then that milk is assumed to be kosher. Because we have a klal, kol hayotze min hatame, tame, kol hayotze min hatahor, tahor. Anything that comes from a source of kashrus is kosher. Anything that comes from a source of non-kosher is non-kosher. So, Pashib Shat, when you're milking a cow, are cows a kosher species? Yes. Cloven hooves, chew its cud. Is the cow treif? Is the cow assumed to be treif? So that you don't really know until you shech the cow. But a dairy cow, you're not going to shech as long as it's actually giving milk. So how do we know it's a kosher cow? How do we know it's not a treifa?
X-ray the lungs.
Oh, so the Gemara says that we have rov behemos ksheros, right? The majority of animals we assume not to be treifa. So based on rov, anytime you get milk from a kosher species, we assume it's not a treifa. So the animal has a din of kosher, and therefore the milk has a din of kosher as well. Now there is a question: why, even if a cow is kosher, kol hayotze min ha-tahor is tahor, that would be, let's say you shech the cow and you check the lungs, so it's a kosher species, it's not a treifa. So that means any part of that animal, anything that comes from that animal, even if you wouldn't generally eat it because it's kind of gross, but it's officially kosher. But let's say the cow is still alive, and unfortunately you lost the toe. Now cows don't really have toes, but right. Part of the hoof, it got disconnected. Am I allowed to eat that? Let's say part of the body gets cut off. Unfortunately, it gets caught in the fence, right? Little chaticha roilis kabed comes out of that. Oh, so before the shechita, if the cow's alive, so there we would l'chora say anything that comes from an animal when it's still living would be Eivir Menachai. So generally, when you milk a cow, is the cow alive or dead? Right? Usually it's alive. So there's a discussion about Chol of Mesa. That's in Pei Zayin. But usually when you milk a cow, it's coming from an animal that's still living. And therefore, all milk, even if it's coming from a behemoth tahara, right? It's a species that's kosher. And we could assume, let's say, based on Rove, that it's not a treifa, so it's for sure kosher, Rove Paskins, but milk should still be usher because it's Eivir Menachai. Based on that logic, you could argue that eggs coming from a chicken, right? It's a kosher species, and we assume that everything is good, but eggs are also Eivir Menachai. So that's why, generally speaking, frum people do not drink milk and do not eat eggs, based on that concern of Eivir Menachai. Okay, weiter. So what's the heter? Why don't we say that milk and eggs are usher based on Eivir Menachai? Oh, So Reb Michal's back and on fire today. We view it as a separate entity. What are you eating there? Maybe that's the okay. Everyone else having bagels. So there's actually a drasha. The drasha is, how is Eretz Yisrael described? It's a land flowing with eggs and honey, with milk and honey, right? Eretz zavas chalav u'devash. So we learn from there that if it's praising Eretz Yisrael for having milk, obviously the assumption is that you're allowed to drink the milk. So there's a shach in Yeridei and Peizayin who says that same drasha that teaches us that milk is mutter and it's not considered ever menachai, that drasha is not a gezeres hakasuv, but it's being megala, it's revealing to us an insight that anything that's not viewed as part and parcel of the behema, but it's somewhat distinct, and it comes from the animal, gesundheit, so then that would not have a violation of Iver Menachai. And based on that logic, says the Shach, that's why eggs are kosher also.
And it's also something which is forced to come out. In other words, it's never really part of the thing because its creation is to come out.
So you're giving a potential hesber as to why it's viewed as disconnected.
Right.
Okay. But it's an amazing idea. The Shach is telling us, without the pasuk of Eretz Zavas Chalav Devash, the assumption would have been that milk from a kosher animal and eggs from kosher chickens are treif. That's an amazing idea.
What about the idea of shooing the bird, though, and stealing the eggs? That's a mitzvah. What wouldn't that not count?
You're saying, can we show from the fact that there's a mitzvah of shiluach hakan that eggs must be kosher? Oh, good discussion as well.
There's a debate whether the mitzvah is
Okay.
to eat them or just to
Okay. Anyway, so generally speaking, we say if milk is coming from a kosher species, it's assumed to be kosher because rov behemas ksheros. It's not a violation of ever menachai because we have the pasuk. Although eggs are very expensive nowadays, right? Aaron was pointing out that the fact we're still serving eggs when there's a shortage and every egg is worth a lot of money, that's a very chashuv thing. What has changed potentially in the last few decades that brings up more of a shaila? Can we really assume that all cows are kosher? What has changed? So there's something called DA, District Attorney, or right? What does DA stand for? What? Drug Administration. Okay. I'm looking for something else.
Dan Armstrong?
Dislocated embolism. Right? That was the tip of the tongue. We know that a cow has 4 different stomachs. And there seems to be, right, one of the 4, it's common for it to get dislocated, causing a real buildup of gas and other things that are unhealthy for the cow. So there is a procedure where you basically go in and you puncture that stomach in a way that allows the gas to come out, helping the health and vitality of the cow. That procedure might, and this is a whole discussion unto itself, but that might render the cow a treifa.
But you see that the cow stays alive in most of these cases.
Okay. Now, usually the definition of a treifa is based on the gedarim of Chazal, right? So if Chazal tell us that a certain type of puncture has a din of a treifa, it's a treifa. Now, it's a good point that if this procedure is being done to hundreds of thousands of cows around the world, and they're all living long and healthy lives for many, many years, it's not a treifa. But let's just say it's a questionable issue, and maybe it does render the cow a treifa.
The animal activists already,
Perhaps there are animal activists out there.
What about Tsar Baalei Chayim? Helping the
What's that?
Tsar Baalei Chayim?
So Tsar Baalei Chayim, it's a good question, but you're doing it to help the animal. Right? Now, it's interesting. Why is this a new question? Did cows not have this problem let's say 70 years ago? Only in the last 30 years did they, start having a more difficult time digesting their food? So the answer seems to be it's based on what they're fed. So in the olden days, cows would roam free and they would generally graze on grass. And that's more of their natural, organic, hormone free. Everything was great and therefore their stomach was fine. However, in more recent times, it seems like we're feeding them a lot of cheap grain. Perhaps corn is their main staple, and it doesn't go down as easily as grass. So that could be the reason why it's only the last few decades this is more of an issue, and therefore this procedure is more commonplace. What percentage of cows have this procedure? So it's a good question, probably depends on where you are and many other factors, but it could be between 20 and 30% of cows. Oh, so if you do a little bit higher math now, that's still less than the majority, right? So what's the problem? Problem is like this. In the olden days, how would you milk a cow, right? You bring the cow into the barn, the milking area, and you milk the cow. So then you might have, theoretically, to make it simple, you have 100 cows on the farm, and each one you're milking into their own little bucket, their own little basin. You bring in all of the buckets of milk. Even if we'll assume 20 or 30% are trephos, but you look at each bucket and you say, is this from the rov or from the miut? So obviously rov paskins. Kol haporish, right? Anything that's coming from a mixture, we assume it's from the majority. So even though I might know logically that out of all of these buckets of milk, 20 or 30 of them might be treif, but rov would paskin on each one, it's kosher, and therefore I'm allowed to use every single one. What makes it more complicated, Bisman Hazeh? You have a whole, if you've ever seen, right, a real milking process, you mamish have these massive, wheels where you put in all the cows together, and it's definitely automated. You don't have people there, milking it manually. All of the milk is basically, coming together in these massive vats. And therefore, every huge container of milk is really a combination of potentially hundreds and hundreds of cows. So now it's a whole different question. If we're to assume that 20 or 30% of the cows are treif because of this procedure, and all the milk is mamish mu'urav, it's mixed together, so maybe if I wanted to know, am I allowed to eat this particular cow, the halacha is, rov cows are still kosher, of course you could eat the cow. Okay? But now that all the milk is together, if 20 or 30% of this milk is non-kosher, so do you need rov or do you need shishim? Do you need just the majority to be kosher milk? Or do you need 60 times kosher versus treif?
Don't we say that as it goes into the vat, it's mevatel? So meaning we're looking at it now, at the end of the day, 2 days later we have a vat of milk that's all mixed together. But as each cow is milked, it goes into the vat and is bottled.
But in order for it to be bottled, the question is, do you need rov or do you need shishim?
Why wouldn't it be rov, just like we said before?
So rov is when you're looking at the entity, right? So here's the classic case. You have 3 pieces of meat, and you know that 2 are kosher and 1 is not kosher, but they all look the exact same. So there, we would say rov paskins, each one is kosher.
But if someone had already cooked all 3 pieces of meat together in a chunk, we still say rov is kosher, don't we?
Ooh, so there we say when it's cooked together, when it's mu'urav, then it's no longer chad b'trei, all right? There you have to have shishim. So even though here it's not officially cooked together, but it's all mu'urav together, so l'chora you'd have to have shishim. Now here's where the complexity comes in.
That's the point that it doesn't go directly, you don't, in the factory line, you don't have the cow being milked directly into a vat. So it's so you could do your costing in the tubes.
Paskening on the tubes, you're suggesting? Okay, so how about before we allow ourselves to get too sophisticated, right? Let me just share one idea here, okay? Do you need rov or do you need shishim? So we know as follows: Min haTorah, when you have min b'she'eno mino, you have a different species, right? So let's say you have um, one piece of chazer, and then you have two pieces of kosher cow meat. And they look the same. I can't tell them apart, theoretically. If they're now all cooked together, the fact that I had two pieces of kosher and one piece of treif will not help me. Because the tam of the treif, we paskin the tam ke'ikr midiraisa, the flavor of that treif will definitely be present. So the only way for that to be kosher is you have to have shishim, right? You have to have 60 pieces of kosher meat in contrast to that one piece of chazer. Let's say, though, it's all the same species, where the three pieces of meat are all coming from cows. One cow is an avela, meaning one piece of meat you bought at public, so obviously it wasn't shechted properly, it has a din of an avela, and the other two came from the grove. And they were cooked together. So do you need shishim? The answer is min haTorah you don't, because it all has the same exact tam. So you don't have to be mevatel the tam. There's no need to nullify the flavor, because the flavor of treif you're not going to be tasting as long as you have rov kosher. So min haTorah chad b'trei is sufficient. However, there we paskin that midirabanan you have to have shishim. Whenever you have a mixture, a taruvis, right, you're cooking these pieces of meat together, or if it's not even cooking, but in a case where you have a treif cow, and you have kosher cows, and you're getting milk from all of them together, so then it's mu'urav. You would argue that min haTorah, as long as you have the majority kosher cows, this milk is kosher, because it's one min. However, midirabanan you'd have to have shishim. So based on that background, all right, Pashut Pshat comes out that you have all these cows that are getting milk together, all going into the same massive basin of milk. You have rov, so min haTorah, it would be okay. It'd be kosher, because it's the same min. However, midirabanan, lechora, it would be treif, because midirabanan you have to have shishim. So that's why, right, you could make a very valid argument that all milk that we have bisman hazeh, assuming that 20 or 30% of the animals are considered treif based on this procedure, so all milk would be kosher min haTorah and asur midirabanan. Now, just to clarify, this whole conversation is before we get to the iyon of what's chalav Yisrael. We're not talking about chalav Yisrael, right? Chalav Yisrael is clearly a din derabanan that we're not discussing today. Today, we're only talking about the actual halacha of milk, meaning assuming all Jews are involved. This is happening in Eretz Yisrael. Everyone is Jewish. Even Eretz Yisrael is not the case, right? But theoretically, everyone in the factory was Jewish, and they're all looking at it carefully. It's all chalav Yisrael. You have the same question. The milk that's being produced should be mutter min haTorah, but asur midirabanan. Interesting, right? Question, doctor.
And just to let you know where I'm at, is this is we still have to decide whether that procedure, right, is an issue.
We have to decide whether or not that procedure actually renders it a treifa, but let's assume for this conversation that it does. Okay.
We have low paper. No, we have low 20, 30%.
20 or 30% is treif.
And we have 20, 30% that we assume are treif.
Based on this, it's all the same 20 or 30%, right? Because it's mixed together, you don't have shishim, so milk should be asur midirabanan. This is a question that has been addressed by many. More recently, Rav Asher Weiss in the Tshuva speaks about this. Let's take a look here in the first page, where the question is presented. This is page Kuf Chavav. Basher shol ledati b'dover mash oru la'achrona b'inyan kashrus hachalav. You're requesting my opinion regarding a topic that's come up recently with kashrus achalav. Yisod ha'she'ela mashi yadua sheyesh echos nikar shel behemo shehein trefos o lepachos suffik trefos. The question's predicated on the knowledge that there is a percentage, a significant percentage of cows that are trefos or suffik trefos based on this procedure. V'im kein mistaver da'af dazlinan basuro v'muter lishtos chalva ule'echoles besara shel kol behem v'hema v'litlo shehi min harov haksheros. Even though if you were just taking one cow and you want to know, can I shech the cow and can I drink its milk? The answer would be, of course, because Rov Paskins, this cow is kosher. But nowadays you're mixing together the milk of hundreds of cows. How can we say that they're all kosher? Which is keneged. It's in direct contrast to the reality that there are probably about 20% that are treifa. Since it's all together and you have trefos, you have to have a bittul b'shishim, at least midirabanan, like we explained. Ulefi hayadua mispar trefos hu lepachos ke'esrim echos v'imkein kol hataruvos asura. If you're working with this assumption that you're 20% of cows that are trefos, so then all milk should be asur midirabanan.
This question presumably is not even telling that procedure.
So it's right. It's not totally in the procedure. The reason why it's more of a shayla bizman hazeh, or perhaps this high of a percentage, seems to be based on that procedure. But, right.
But no, not his question, even if it would be 5%, it would still be a problem.
Right. And any time you're not going to have a bittul b'shishim, you would have the same question.
But he's going, assuming this procedure?
Well, so the truth is, like Rabbi Muscat's pointing out, this is a valid question, even if this whole problem of the DA never existed. If you could somehow show that you have 4 or 5% of cows that are trefos, and the way we milk cows is you have hundreds of them and they're being milked all together, you'd have the same question.
Something treifa?
Well, if you look throughout the world,
It's not 1% or 2%, then you would have shishim.
if you had 1%, right, you would have shishim.
Even 2%.
2% is 1/50th, yeah.
4% milk.
2% milk. That's good. That's why only 1% milk is kosher. That's good. So that's the question. Now, it's interesting the way he explains here. We're not going to have a chance to go through the entirety of the tshuva, but just to open our minds a little bit and to feel more comfortable that drinking milk is still kosher. All of this discussion and concern, I feel, is really, it's a mistake. There's a mistaken premise here. Yisod hatos b'meshech lifu bein din Torah da'acharab lahatos. The source of this mistake is mixing up the din Torah of following the majority, acharab lahatos, with what we call scientific statistics. Those are two separate things. Statistics and a din rov are not the same. The af, im omnam nochon adavar, even if it happens to be true, that statistically speaking, in every farm where you have hundreds of these cows, you'll have a significant percentage that are trefos. Elayesh la'aniach k'she'echos hamiyut hakloli yesher yiyeh, kach echos hamiyut gam be'eder zeh, ach lo kein bedin Torah, da'azlinan basarov. But just because that may be true statistically, it doesn't mean that's true in the din Torah when we follow rov. Ulefi mishpat haTorah daininan b'chol behema din keshera. Based on the din Torah of rov, we look at every behema individually, and it has the status of kosher. Umamela afim yitztarfu behemos rabos kulan kasheros lefi din Torah. And therefore, even if you mamish mix all the milk together, it would still be kosher according to the din Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'hakol neh b'dvaro.
Is that working with the assumption this is an industrial operation?
So let's explain the words that he's saying, and then we'll have to give a little bit of color to it. He's basically saying, I don't care about the statistics. Now, that's not entirely true. We do care about the statistics, because if theoretically 80 or 90% of these cows were proven to be treif, and that was the mitzias in every farm, then based on the statistics, that would be koveya the din rov. All the cows would be treif, and all the milk would be treif. So you can't disconnect the world of statistics from the din Torah of rov completely. What he seems to be saying, though, is when we have a din rov, it depends on what the question is. What's the initial question? What's that? Oh, so milk being kosher or treif is 100% dependent on is the cow kosher or treif, right? So because that's the halachic shaila, the shaila is, are these animals kosher or treif? So you would look at every animal, and based on rov, you would paskin the animal is kosher. Now, one interesting raya that he brings, he says, think of the classic case. You have a case where the Gemara in Ksubis, Teisha Chanuyos, you have 9 stores selling kosher meat, and you have 1 store selling treif meat. And let's just assume, to make it very straightforward, every store is selling the same amount of meat, and they all look the same. Okay. Now you happen to find 1 piece of meat outside on the street. Any normal human being would probably choose not to eat that piece of meat. However, if you're in a bind and you wanted to take it home and eat it, are you allowed to do so? So the answer is, yeah, because we don't know which one of the 10 stores it came from. Acharei rab mulahatos, rov paskins. And that would be true even if you had 6 stores that were kosher and 4 stores that were treif. Says Rav Asher Weiss, but let's say theoretically, instead of finding 1 piece of meat, you found 50 pieces of meat. What's the halacha in that case? Right? So every store is selling hundreds and hundreds of pieces of meat. I found 50 pieces of meat right here outside of all of the chanuyos. So do we say, listen, statistically speaking, you'll have 10% of these pieces of meat, we assume they're treif. Is the halacha I could only eat 90%? The halacha is you could have all 50 of them. Because on each piece you look at it and you say, where did you come from? And the little piece of meat says back, I came from the rov, right? And that's true for every single piece of meat. He gives another interesting example. There's a Gemara that speaks about, you have a city of hundreds of thousands in population, and you find a little child. You're not sure if he's Jewish or if he's non-Jewish. You want to know if you could use him for a minyan. Let's assume he's just 13. You don't know if he's Jewish or non-Jewish. Exactly. The main thing to take away is when you find meat on the ground, eat it, and when you find a small child, just bring him in for a minute if needed. Let me just finish this case. So you don't know if he's Jewish or not. What's the halacha? You go based on rov. The majority of the city, are they Yidden? The majority of the city is Jewish, then the child has a din of being a Jew. Okay. But let's say, says Rav Asher Weiss, you do this for 10 years. And over these 10 years, for some strange reason, you find many, many children, right? Can you count them all for the minyan? Or, right, let's say, Lamosh, you find 10 altogether. So I could say, well, based on the percentage of the city, statistically speaking, if it's only 60% Jewish, so then I could only count 6 out of the 10. I can't use them all to be mitzvah for a minyan. But that's not the halacha. The halacha is rov paskins, again, because whether or not this child is Jewish is based on where the child comes from. And even that is somewhat not counterintuitive, but it's not rational. Because shouldn't I look at, well, how many Jewish women are there in the city, between the ages of whatever childbirth age? That's a more logical place to look. But we don't even do that. It's rove of the city. So obviously rove is much more than a logic, it's a din. So to make the application, when it comes to milk, whether or not milk is kosher is all based on where it comes from. Because that's the shaila, so then rove paskins on every cow, this cow is kosher. Which comes out an incredible idea. If you're looking at any bottle of milk, you know, if these statistics are applicable, you know that 20% of this milk is coming from cows that are not kosher. And therefore, the pashut shat would be, because you don't have shishim, this milk is aser midirabanan. But the fact that the din rove paskins that every cow is kosher, this milk is mutter l'chadchila. Right? It's an incredible idea. Question.
So I just have a question, because in a case where you have 50 pieces of meat sitting out in the city, these are 50 separate pieces of meat, and you know that, say there's a majority of kosher stores, the meat can't come from more than one store, right? It has to come from a single store. So it's completely possible that every single piece of meat, no matter how unlikely statistically, would you get the statistics,
It's
but would
completely
come from a
possible that
kosher-
every single piece of meat is kosher.
is kosher.
Okay, I
Right.
mean, it's also
Whereas-
completely possible that every cow is kosher
No,
as
it's
well.
not, because it's all getting mixed together. You know they have.
No, but
these
again,
cows.
the question is not on the milk, right? The kashrus of the milk is based on the question: is the cow that the milk came from kosher?
And you know that their cow, 20% of the cows are not, and you know it's all getting
But
mixed
if the
together.
question is on the cows, this is where it gets subtle. If the question is on the cows, rove paskins, every cow is kosher.
Right? So you're not asking
I
questions
want
on the
to.
milk.
Well, that's the idea here. Yes.
Could we just please review what it's saying here? Is the issue with the statistics on the, I'm a little confused because I understand that there's a difference between husbanding on single entities of cow, deciding whether the cow is kosher. But it seems like he's saying something altogether different about statistics.
So what I think he means to be saying is that even though statistically speaking, the milk, when you're looking at the bottle, it makes sense that 20 or so percent of this milk is coming from non-kosher cows. But that's not machriya the din, because when it comes to halacha, often the halacha is based on what is the proper halachic question to ask. So here, that question is, are the cows kosher? And the answer is yes, right? Maybe just to flesh it out, it makes it somewhat more complicated, but it's an interesting distinction. There's another tshuva where somebody asked Rav Asher Weiss that it seems like your psak regarding milk is in direct contradiction with the different psak that you give in your Sefer Minchas Asher on Sefer Vayikra, where you speak about is a Kohen allowed to walk into a hospital. So we know that for Kohanim, they're not allowed to make themselves tameh. That's why they can't go to a cemetery, right? Obviously, with the exception of their 7 krovim. Going into a hospital setting, the shaila is maybe there's someone in the hospital who's no longer alive, and walking in, there's tumas ohel. So Rosh Weiss passes, and we're not going to get too into the details of this question now, so don't worry, Gershom. Don't worry. But Rav Asher Weiss paskins that if it's the type of hospital that likely you will have people who are no longer living, walking in would be problematic. So the way that he asked the question here, this is in the next tshuva in Siman Mem, Kuf Chav Ches. Let's take a look at the first paragraph together. This is really where Rav Asher Weiss is answering, but he's making a very interesting distinction. Dihine binyan hashayla shinisara lifnei shana mispar binyan kashrus achalav beretz Yisrael. Regarding the shaila of the milk, I wrote in a previous tshuva that even if you have a strong percentage, 20 or so percent of the animals being trephos, bottom line is we go based on rov, and that paskins that every animal is kosher, and therefore the milk is kosher as well. Mi'idach, in the next paragraph he says, on the other hand, I wrote in my sefer Minchas Asher on this V'yikra, in Parshas Emor, the asur l'kohen l'kones l'beis cholim, kasher yadanu shemistama yesh bo mace. Also to walk into a hospital where the assumption is that there's a mace. Va'av shema midim kol adam b'cheskas chai. So we do have a chazaka, the Gemara in Gittin and elsewhere speaks about this, that every person, if I'm not sure if he's still alive or not, there's a cheskas chai, which means he was alive before. The halachic assumption is Jerry still alive? The answer is yes. He's b'cheskas chai. Ein ze ela kasher donim anu al adam mesuyim. Ava kasher hashe'ela hi im yesh meis bebayis lo mahani bezeh cheskas chai she'al kol adam. So I said regarding that shaila of a Kohen walking into the hospital, the fact that every individual has a chazaka that they're still alive, that's a personal din. If you want to know about this guy in particular, so then yes, the chazaka is he's still alive. But you're walking into the hospital, the shaila is there someone here who's no longer living? In all likelihood, the answer is yes. So the Shoel, the one writing the question, was asking, that sounds like a contradiction. Interesting question. Oh, so that's really what he answers. And again, this is it's a subtle distinction, but it all gets back to what is the halachic question. So regarding milk, the question is, milk is either kosher or treif, totally based on where it came from. So the question is, are the cows kosher or treif? Rov paskins that cows are kosher. Here, there's never a question, is this individual still alive? Is he or she still living? The question is there a mace in the beis cholim? Well, the answer to that question is, in all likelihood, unfortunately, yes. So don't walk in. Yes, doctor.
I could see the logic, this logic applied to cows in like 1998, right?
The logic of what?
Of cows and milk. If we were talking about like 1998, that you have a bunch of cows, you're doing procedures to some of them, and you just kind of like put them back in the herd. But I'm assuming that in 2025, we're chipping cows, you can scan each one, you have a complete history of each one of them. So it's no longer, what if it's no longer road works when you don't know.
So Dr. Sloan is asking a very, very deep question, which is, they have a little tag on their ear, right? And you can just scan that tag, and it tells you everything you want to know and more about that particular cow, right? Dorothy was born 7 years ago in a ranch in Alabama, right? She was born at, this many pounds and had these injections and vaccines. It was discovered that she had a DA 3 years ago. The procedure took place 2 years ago. So you know everything about every cow, and therefore the question is, maybe you can't rely on rov, because rov is only true when it's ef shar levarer, right? You can't really find out what the reality is, what the din is. But here, if I could just scan the little tag on her ear and find out that she's from the miut that's treif, maybe you don't have a rov in the first place. If you don't have a rov in the first place, then that means milk should be treif. Okay? Sorry. Feel bad we're ending like this. Anyway, Lemay says it's a much longer and more elaborate discussion exploring Bechlal, whether or not these procedures do make the cow treif. But a little bit of an insight into the sugya. Have a wonderful day. Shkoyach.
I thought of it